She was a soldier, a fighter, a daughter, and a friend. She stood tall in uniform, ready to defend her country, but when she needed protecting the most, when she cried out for help, the very institution she dedicated her life to abandoned her. The weight of betrayal, silence, and suffering became unbearable. And on one tragic day, Morgan Robinson took her own life. This is the story of a woman who gave everything to serve, only to be destroyed from within. But before we dive into this heartbreaking story, take a second, hit that subscribe button. If you care about uncovering the truth, giving a voice to the unheard, and demanding justice for victims like Morgan, then you're in the right place. Subscribing helps bring awareness to these stories, and together we can make sure they're never forgotten. Alright, let's get into it. Morgan Robinson was a dedicated National Guard officer who believed in duty, honor, and service. But behind the uniform she was enduring a nightmare. She suffered relentless harassment, assault, and betrayal, not by the enemy but by those who were supposed to stand beside her. When she reached out for help, she was met with silence. When she begged for justice, she was ignored. And when she could no longer carry the weight of her trauma, she made a heartbreaking decision. This is not just her story, it's the story of countless others failed by the system. Morgan's story isn't just about one woman's suffering, it's about a system designed to protect but, instead, enables abuse. It's about how reports of sexual violence are buried, how victims are silenced, and how those in power walk away without consequence. Her story is a devastating example of what happens when the people we trust to uphold justice turn a blind eye to suffering. This case exposes the deep-rooted issues of sexual violence within the military. Morgan Robinson's death was not an accident. It was the result of a system that failed her at every turn. It's time we confront the truth, demand accountability, and fight for change, because silence is no longer an option. Morgan Robinson wasn't just a soldier, she was a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Before the uniform, before the deployments, she was a bright, compassionate young woman growing up in a tight-knit family. Born and raised in rural America, Morgan had an upbringing filled with love, laughter, and the values of hard work and determination. Those who knew her best described her as fiercely independent, always standing up for what was right, even as a child. She was the type of person who could walk into a room and light it up. Always willing to help others, always looking out for the underdog. Her mother, Debbie Robinson, remembers Morgan as someone who would go out of her way to make people smile. She was strong both physically and emotionally, and had an unshakable spirit. From an early age, Morgan was drawn to the idea of service. She wasn't the type to sit on the sidelines, she wanted to make a difference. The military felt like the perfect fit. It was a way to channel her strength, her determination, and her desire to protect others into something bigger than herself. She saw the Army National Guard as a path to not only challenge herself but also to build a meaningful career, one where she could stand for something greater. Her decision wasn't just about duty, it was about purpose. She wanted to serve her country with pride, to be part of something honorable. And when she finally enlisted, it was one of the proudest moments of her life. Basic training was grueling, but Morgan was built for it. She pushed herself to the limit, excelling both physically and mentally. She adapted quickly, learning discipline, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of brotherhood and sisterhood that comes with military life. She didn't just meet expectations, she exceeded them. Her superiors took notice of her work ethic, her leadership potential, and her unwavering sense of duty. She took on every challenge with a sense of pride, proving to herself and others that she belonged. Outside of her uniform, Morgan was a fighter in every sense of the word. She was tough, but she had a heart full of kindness. Friends say she had an infectious laugh, a warm spirit, and a fierce loyalty to those she loved. She was the kind of person who would drop everything to help a friend in need. Her family recalls how passionate she was about standing up for what she believed in. If something was unfair or unjust, Morgan wouldn't stay silent. She believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. When Morgan received her deployment orders, she was ready. She had trained for this moment. She believed in the mission, in the people around her, and in the idea that serving in the military meant protecting others. But what she didn't know, what no amount of training could have prepared her for, was the nightmare that awaited her. The real enemy wasn't on the battlefield. It wasn't an outside threat. It was much closer. It was within her own ranks. Morgan Robinson was about to walk into something far more dangerous than she ever could have imagined. When Morgan Robinson arrived in Kuwait, she was stepping into a world of discipline, duty, and routine. She took her role seriously, dedicating herself to the mission. Her job wasn't glamorous, it was long hours, relentless heat, and demanding tasks. But she didn't complain. She was there to serve, to protect, and to uphold the values she believed in. Her days were spent immersed in military operations, whether it was training exercises, logistical work, or simply keeping things running smoothly on base. It was a male-dominated environment, but that didn't intimidate her. Morgan had always been tough. She knew how to hold her own. But what she didn't know, what no one warned her about, was that the real danger wouldn't come from an enemy in combat. It would come from the very people who were supposed to have her back. Among the ranks there was a man, a superior officer, who had power, influence, and a dark intent. At first it was subtle. Small, seemingly insignificant moments. A lingering stare. An offhand comment that made her uncomfortable. A brush of physical contact that didn't seem accidental. Morgan knew how to handle herself. She had been in the military long enough to know that being a woman in uniform meant dealing with a certain level of inappropriate behavior. But this was different. This wasn't a few crude jokes or an uncomfortable glance. This was targeted. The superior officer had made up his mind. Morgan wasn't just another soldier to him, she was prey. And he was about to show her just how little her strength and resilience mattered when power was on his side. What started as harassment escalated quickly. He began isolating her, finding excuses to keep her back from group tasks, to put her in situations where she was alone with him. Then one night it happened. The assault. No one came to help her. No one heard her. She was violated by someone who outranked her, someone she was supposed to trust. And when it was over, she wasn't just physically wounded, she was shattered. She was a soldier. She had been trained to handle war, to survive combat. But nothing had prepared her for this kind of battle. Despite the shame, despite the fear, Morgan made a decision that many victims never do. She reported it. It took everything in her to walk into that office, to sit down with a superior officer and say the words out loud. She laid it all out, the truth, the horror of what had happened. She expected, maybe even hoped, that this was where things would change. That the military, the institution she had dedicated her life to, would stand by her, protect her, bring her justice. But that's not what happened. Her report was met with indifference. No investigation. No disciplinary action. No justice. The higher-ups who were supposed to uphold honor, integrity, and accountability did nothing. Maybe it was to protect the reputation of the officer involved. Maybe they just didn't care. Morgan was left to walk the same halls as the man who had assaulted her. To stand in formation beside those who knew what had happened but refused to act. She was a soldier, but in this war she was fighting alone. The silence was deafening. The betrayal was crushing. She had done everything right, she spoke up, she followed the chain of command, she put her trust in the system. And the system abandoned her. Her mental state began to unravel. She became withdrawn, carrying the weight of what had happened, the shame, the anger, the isolation. She had survived an attack, but what was breaking her was the realization that in the eyes of those in power, she didn't matter. And what she didn't know then, what she couldn't have known, was that this was only the beginning. Because soon she would be sent to Afghanistan. And what awaited her there was far worse. After everything that had happened in Kuwait, Morgan Robinson was desperate for a fresh start. When she was transferred to Afghanistan, part of her hoped that things would be different, that maybe, just maybe, she could leave the nightmare behind. New faces, new leadership, a new mission. It should have been a second chance. But instead it was a death sentence. Afghanistan was dangerous, but not just because of enemy forces. There was another kind of threat, one she already knew too well. And this time it wouldn't just be one man. One night, in the midst of war, surrounded by people she was supposed to trust with her life, Morgan was attacked again. But this time it was worse. Multiple soldiers. It wasn't just an assault, it was a coordinated, brutal attack by men in uniform. Men who should have had her back. Men who were supposed to fight alongside her, not destroy her. It was dehumanizing. Violent. Inescapable. And when it was over, she wasn't just left broken. She was left completely alone. Morgan had already learned the hard way what happened when you reported assault in the military. In Kuwait, she had done everything right, she had spoken up, she had trusted the system, she had believed in justice. And the system had spat in her face. Why would this be any different? Why go through the humiliation of recounting every horrific detail, only to be met with silence again? Why risk retaliation, blame, or even being labeled as the problem? She knew the truth, no one would help her. So she kept it inside. But carrying that kind of pain, alone, unspoken, unresolved, it's like carrying a grenade with the pin already pulled. Eventually it's going to explode. The weight of everything was crushing her. The first assault had already left her raw, betrayed, and struggling. But this? This was something else entirely. She was trapped in a war zone, surrounded by the very people who had hurt her. There was no escape, no safe place, no justice. She had given everything to serve, and in return, the people she trusted had shattered her. And that's when it happened. The moment she realized she couldn't keep fighting this war anymore. Not the one overseas. Not the one in her head. Not the one in her heart. And soon, Morgan Robinson, this strong, brave, dedicated soldier, would make the most heartbreaking decision of all. Something in Morgan changed after Afghanistan. She had always been a fighter, resilient, determined, the kind of person who could take a hit and keep going. But after everything she had endured, the light in her eyes started to fade. Friends and fellow soldiers noticed it. She became withdrawn, distant. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter became rare. The woman who once thrived on being a protector now struggled to protect herself from the demons clawing at her mind. Some nights she barely slept. Some days she barely spoke. And when she did, there was a heaviness to her voice, like someone carrying a burden too massive to bear. But the military is a machine. It keeps moving no matter who falls behind. And Morgan? She was falling fast. In the days leading up to her death, Morgan gave off signals, warnings that, in hindsight, should have set off alarms. She reached out to her mother, Debbie Robinson, more than usual. But she didn't talk about what happened in Kuwait. She didn't mention the horrors of Afghanistan. Instead, she carried the weight of it all in silence. Debbie could sense something was wrong. A mother always knows. Morgan was breaking. The strong, fearless soldier had been worn down to the point where there was nothing left to give. She had asked for help before. She had screamed into a system that refused to listen. And now she was tired of screaming. On August 21, 2018, Morgan Robinson ended her own life. Alone, surrounded by the echoes of betrayal, she made the only decision she felt was left. A decorated soldier. A woman who had risked her life for her country. A person who should have been protected, who should have been defended, gone. And the military, the very institution she had served so faithfully, had done nothing to stop it. When the knock came at Debbie Robinson's door, she already knew. The words, the uniformed officers, the official statement, it was all a blur. Nothing could prepare a mother for hearing that her daughter was gone. Not from enemy fire. Not from combat. But from the unbearable weight of betrayal, assault, and silence. Morgan's story should have ended with medals, with honor, with a long life ahead of her. Instead, it ended in tragedy, a tragedy that never should have happened. But this isn't where the story ends. Because Morgan's family wasn't about to let her death be just another statistic. They were about to take on the very system that failed her. After Morgan's death, the army finally did what it had refused to do while she was alive. It opened an investigation. But for anyone who thought this would lead to justice, the reality was far more disheartening. The probe into Morgan's assaults and the circumstances surrounding her death wasn't a deep dive into accountability. It wasn't an effort to correct the failures that had destroyed her life. Instead, it was a carefully controlled damage assessment, more about protecting the institution than exposing the truth. When the investigation concluded, Morgan's family was handed a report. But there was just one problem: huge portions of it were blacked out. Redacted. Censored. The very answers Debbie Robinson desperately needed to understand what had happened to her daughter were buried under thick, black ink. It was as if the army was saying, "Yes, we looked into it. No, you don't get to know what we found." Despite the redactions, one damning truth still made its way into the official findings. Morgan Robinson's death was directly linked to sexual, physical, and psychological trauma that she endured while serving. That was as close to an admission of guilt as the military was willing to give. But even that meant nothing without action. Because knowing the truth and doing something about it are two very different things. Morgan had suffered in silence, endured relentless abuse, and when she found the courage to report her assault in Kuwait, she had been ignored. Now, with an investigation finally complete, surely justice was on its way, right? No. The officer who had assaulted Morgan in Kuwait, the man who had abused his power, preyed on her, and contributed to the chain of events that led to her death, received a written reprimand. A piece of paper. That was it. A document in his file, 8 months after Morgan was gone. No court-martial. No serious consequences. Just a note, as if what he had done was nothing more than a minor disciplinary issue. For Morgan's family, it was a slap in the face. Debbie Robinson had already lost her daughter. Now she was losing faith in any form of justice. She had thought, hoped, that the military would take responsibility, that someone would step forward and say, "We failed her. We should have done more." But instead, they handed her a redacted report, a vague acknowledgement of trauma, and an empty punishment for the man who had started Morgan's nightmare. How do you make peace with that? How do you grieve when every attempt to find answers is met with silence and secrecy? Debbie wasn't just heartbroken. She was angry. And she wasn't about to let her daughter's story be forgotten. Morgan Robinson was let down at every turn. She was assaulted by a superior officer in Kuwait, and no one protected her. She reported it and no one listened. She was sent to Afghanistan, where she was brutally attacked again. She chose not to report it, because she already knew the military wouldn't help her. She reached a breaking point, and no one saved her. And even after her death, the system that had failed her in life continued to fail her in death. Her case wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger pattern. One where victims of sexual violence in the military are silenced, ignored, and discarded. The question wasn't just why did this happen to Morgan? The question was how many more women have to suffer before something changes? For Debbie Robinson, the grief of losing her daughter was unbearable. But the more she learned about the military's failure to protect Morgan, the more that grief turned into determination. Her daughter had been betrayed, by her fellow soldiers, by her superiors, by an institution that claimed to value honor and integrity. And now the army wanted her story to quietly fade away. Debbie refused to let that happen. She began speaking out, sharing Morgan's story with the world. If the military wasn't going to hold itself accountable, she would make sure the public knew the truth. Through interviews, advocacy groups, and media appearances, she made it clear. Morgan's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was an injustice. And something had to change. One of the biggest problems in Morgan's case, and in countless other military sexual assault cases, was that the people responsible for investigating these crimes were part of the same system that allowed them to happen. Commanders, who often had personal and professional relationships with the accused, were the ones deciding whether to pursue charges. That was like asking a corporation to investigate its own fraud scandal. It was never going to result in real justice. Debbie, along with other families and advocates, started pushing for independent investigations into military sexual assault cases. Cases like Morgan's needed to be handled by outside, impartial authorities, not by the same system that had already failed her. Without independent oversight, these crimes would continue to be swept under the rug. As Debbie fought for justice, she realized something chilling. Morgan was not alone. There were other women, other soldiers, other families. Vanessa Guillen, Lavena Johnson. Numerous unnamed victims who never got justice. Women who had been harassed, assaulted, ignored, and, in some cases, killed, whether by their own hands like Morgan or under suspicious circumstances. Morgan's case was heartbreaking, but it wasn't rare. And that was the real tragedy. The problem wasn't just one bad officer. It wasn't just one bad deployment. It was the entire system. Debbie's fight didn't stop with Morgan's story. She joined the growing movement demanding sweeping reforms in how the military handles sexual violence. Independent investigations into sexual assault cases. Stronger protections for victims who report abuse. Harsher punishments for perpetrators. A shift in military culture that no longer enables predators. Change wasn't going to happen overnight. The military had resisted reform for years. But Debbie and other families weren't backing down. For Morgan. For Vanessa. For every soldier who had suffered in silence. The system had failed them. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to fix it. Morgan Robinson was a fighter. She dedicated her life to serving her country, believing in duty, honor, and the bonds of brotherhood. But in the end, the people who were supposed to protect her, the institution she trusted, turned its back on her. Her story is not just about one woman's suffering, it's about a system that repeatedly fails its soldiers. It's about the devastating consequences of silence, negligence, and indifference. Morgan should still be here today. Bringing awareness, the ongoing issue of military sexual violence. What happened to Morgan Robinson isn't an isolated tragedy. It's part of a much bigger crisis. Sexual violence in the military is a reality too many service members face, and yet reports are ignored, cases are covered up, and justice is rarely served. The system is designed to protect the powerful, not the victims. How many more lives have to be lost before real change happens? A call to action: stand up for justice. This story should make us all angry. It should make us demand better. If Morgan's story moved you, don't let it end here. Speak up. Share her story. Support survivors. Push for legislation that ensures independent investigations and accountability within the military. And if you want to hear more stories like this, ones that uncover the truth, demand justice, and give a voice to the voiceless, make sure to subscribe to Silent Weekend Crimes. Together, we can bring light to the darkest corners and make sure that no more lives are lost to silence. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next one.